The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune across the empty 32nd floor of Meridian International, casting long shadows between the rows of cubicles that would soon fill with the morning rush of executives and deal-makers. David Chen pushed his cleaning cart methodically between the desks, his movements precise and practiced after 3 years of working these same halls. The building held a different energy at night, peaceful in a way that the daylight hours never allowed, when the corridors buzzed with urgent phone calls in a dozen languages and the constant shuffle of million-dollar decisions. In the corner office that belonged to the chief financial officer, 80-year-old Tommy Chen sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor, his homework spread in neat piles around him like the petals of a flower. His pencil moved steadily across the math worksheet, pausing occasionally as he whispered the problems to himself in different languages. 2 + 3 = 5, he murmured in English, then switched seamlessly to Mandarin, French, and Spanish, as if testing each language to see which one made the numbers feel most comfortable. David glanced over at his son with the mixture of pride and concern that had become his constant companion since Sarah's death 4 years ago. Tommy had always been special, absorbing languages like a sponge absorbs water, but lately his abilities seemed to be growing at a pace that both amazed and worried his father. The boy picked up new languages from the international news channels David watched while cooking dinner, from conversations he overheard in the building's lobby, from the diverse group of children at his elementary school who spoke their parents' native tongues during recess. Tommy looked up from his worksheet and switched to Korean, asking his father if he could help organize the recycling bins. David smiled and responded in the same language, telling his son to finish his homework first. This nightly routine had developed naturally over the past year, ever since David had been assigned to clean the international business floors where contracts worth millions were negotiated between companies spanning continents. The boy returned to his math problems, but David noticed him practicing pronunciation under his breath, rolling unfamiliar syllables around his mouth like smooth stones. Earlier that week, Tommy had listened to a group of Japanese executives discussing a merger in the elevator, and by the time they reached the lobby, he was already experimenting with the tonal patterns he had absorbed. David knew this gift came with a price, the same price he had paid decades ago when his own linguistic abilities had opened doors to a world he ultimately had to leave behind. As David emptied the waste baskets and wiped down the conference table where tomorrow's crucial meetings would take place, he remembered the days when he had sat at similar tables, not as the man who cleaned them, but as the one whose expertise shaped the conversations that happened across their polished surfaces. Dr. David Chen, former head of the International Relations Department at Columbia University, specialist in cross-cultural communication and diplomatic linguistics. Those credentials felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone whose life had been interrupted by tragedy and reshaped by the simple necessity of providing for his son. Tommy finished his math homework and moved on to his English composition, writing about his dream of traveling to every country in the world and learning to speak with every person he met. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that words carried weight, that language was a bridge between hearts and minds. David watched his son work and wondered if Tommy would face the same choices that had once confronted him, whether brilliance was a gift or a burden when the world demanded that you choose between following your talents and protecting the people you loved most. The cleaning cart squeaked softly as David moved between offices, each room telling its own story through the papers left on desks and the family photos positioned carefully next to computer monitors. These were the spaces where fortunes were made and lost, where handshake agreements sealed partnerships that would span decades, where the wrong word or cultural misunderstanding could derail negotiations that had taken months to arrange. David understood this world intimately, not just from cleaning it every night, but from having lived within its complexity when his life had followed a different path. From his spot on the floor, Tommy looked up and asked in Portuguese if they could stop by the 24th convenience store on the way home to buy ingredients for tomorrow's lunch. David nodded and responded in the same language, then asked his son where he had learned Portuguese so quickly. Tommy shrugged with the casual confidence of childhood and explained that Mrs. Santos from apartment 3B had been teaching him while they waited for the laundry to finish in the building's basement. The boy collected languages the way other children collected baseball cards, trading phrases with neighbors and classmates, building his vocabulary through playground conversations and overheard snippets of adult discussions. The night security guard, Mr. Williams, stopped by during his rounds and greeted both father and son with genuine warmth. He had grown fond of Tommy over the past year, impressed by the boy's politeness and curious about his obvious intelligence. Mr. Williams often brought Tommy small gifts, books from the lost and found or snacks from the vending machines, treating him like the grandchild he had never had. Tonight he handed Tommy a National Geographic magazine featuring an article about the Silk Road, pointing to the colorful photographs of ancient trading routes that had connected distant civilizations through commerce and cultural exchange. Tommy accepted the magazine with enthusiasm and immediately began reading the article aloud, switching between English and Mandarin as he translated particularly interesting passages for his father's benefit. David listened with amazement as his son navigated the complex historical concepts with ease, explaining how ancient merchants had served as linguistic ambassadors, carrying not just goods but languages and ideas across vast distances. The boy's understanding went beyond mere translation. He grasped the cultural significance of communication barriers and the ways that language could either unite or divide different peoples. As the night progressed and David completed his cleaning duties, he reflected on the strange irony of his situation. Here he was, working as a janitor in a building where his academic expertise would be invaluable, watching his son develop the same gifts that had once defined his own identity. The corporate world that surrounded them every night was hungry for the kind of cross-cultural insight that both father and son possessed, yet they remained invisible, their talents hidden behind the simple necessity of earning enough money to pay rent and buy groceries. Tommy packed his homework carefully into his backpack and stood up to stretch, then walked over to the large windows that offered a panoramic view of the city's skyline. The lights from thousands of windows created a constellation of human activity, each illuminated space representing lives and dreams and conversations happening in languages from every corner of the world. The boy pressed his face against the cool glass and whispered a goodnight message in 7 different languages, as if he were speaking directly to all the people whose stories were unfolding behind those distant windows. David finished organizing his cleaning supplies and joined his son at the window, placing a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder as they looked out at the city together. Tomorrow would bring another day of school for Tommy and another day of cleaning for David, but tonight belonged to them, to this quiet moment when father and son stood together high above the bustling world, connected by love and language and the unspoken understanding that they possessed something precious that the world had not yet recognized. As they prepared to leave, Tommy asked his father in Russian why people sometimes forgot that everyone has something special to offer, even if it's not immediately obvious. David smiled at his son's wisdom and responded in the same language, explaining that sometimes the most valuable gifts come in unexpected packages, and that patience and kindness were the keys to helping others see what was truly important. The boy nodded solemnly, then brightened and asked if they could practice Italian on the elevator ride down, since he had heard 2 women speaking it in the lobby that morning and wanted to see if he could remember the melody of their conversation. "Where in the world are you listening to this story tonight, and what time is it in your corner of our vast, interconnected world? Perhaps you're driving home from your own late shift, or maybe you're settling down for the evening with a cup of tea, but wherever you are, you're part of this moment when a father and son stand together, surrounded by the quiet evidence of their hidden extraordinary gifts, waiting for the world to discover what they're truly capable of achieving." The elevator descended through the floors of Meridian International, carrying David and Tommy Chen toward whatever tomorrow might bring, their hearts full of languages and love, their minds bright with possibilities that neither of them could yet imagine. The building settled into its nighttime stillness behind them, but the seeds of change had already been planted in the careful attention Tommy paid to every conversation, in the patient dignity with which David approached his work, and in the mysterious ways that talent and opportunity sometimes find each other when the timing is exactly right. The morning light streamed through the towering glass windows of Meridian International as David Chen arrived for his second shift, this time wearing the navy blue uniform that marked him as part of the building's maintenance staff. The transition from night janitor to day porter had come with a small raise and the mixed blessing of working during business hours, when the halls buzzed with activity and important conversations echoed from every corner. Tommy walked beside him, his small hand gripping his father's as they navigated the bustling lobby filled with executives clutching coffee cups and speaking urgently into their phones. David had arranged for Tommy to spend his after-school hours in the building's employee break room, where the boy could complete his homework under the watchful eye of Mrs. Rodriguez from Human Resources. It was an unconventional arrangement, but one that allowed David to keep his son close while maintaining the income they desperately needed. Tommy had quickly charmed the office staff with his polite demeanor and obvious intelligence, often helping translate simple phrases when international visitors seemed confused by directions or basic requests. Brad Morrison emerged from the elevator on the 15th floor like a man perpetually late for something more important than whatever he was currently doing. His expensive suit hung perfectly on his frame, and his voice carried the particular brand of authority that came from years of middle management success built on the foundation of other people's actual work. Morrison served as the Director of Client Relations, a position that put him in direct contact with Meridian's international partners, though his approach to cross-cultural communication relied heavily on speaking English more loudly and slowly when faced with language barriers. David was restocking paper towels in the men's restroom when Morrison burst through the door, already speaking into his Bluetooth headset with the kind of aggressive confidence that some people mistake for competence. The conversation was clearly not going well, as Morrison's voice grew increasingly strained while he attempted to explain complex contract terms to what sounded like a confused Japanese client. David continued his work quietly, but couldn't help noticing the cultural missteps that Morrison was making with every sentence, the subtle insults hidden within his impatient tone. Morrison ended the call with obvious frustration and noticed David for the first time, his expression immediately shifting to the particular kind of dismissiveness reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. He made a comment about how the building's cleaning standards had been slipping lately, then added that perhaps the maintenance staff should focus more on their actual jobs instead of eavesdropping on important business conversations. David nodded politely and continued his work, accustomed to Morrison's casual condescension but still stung by the injustice of being judged so completely by someone who understood so little. Later that afternoon, as David was cleaning the conference room where Morrison regularly held his client meetings, he overheard another difficult conversation. This time Morrison was attempting to negotiate with a group of German investors over a speakerphone, and his lack of cultural sensitivity was turning what should have been a straightforward discussion into an increasingly tense confrontation. The Germans were clearly frustrated by Morrison's inability to understand their business customs, and David could hear the deal beginning to unravel with each misunderstood exchange. Tommy appeared in the doorway of the conference room, having finished his homework early and received permission from Mrs. Rodriguez to find his father. The boy immediately picked up on the tension in Morrison's voice and the frustrated responses coming through the speakerphone. Without thinking, Tommy quietly asked his father in German if the man on the phone needed help understanding something about American business practices. David quickly hushed his son, but not before Morrison had noticed the exchange. Morrison's reaction was swift and sharp, demanding to know why David's son was wandering around the office and whether the building's security policies meant nothing to the maintenance staff. He made it clear that children had no place in a professional environment, especially children who might overhear sensitive business information. David apologized immediately and explained that Tommy was just looking for him, that the boy would return to the break room right away. Morrison's response was cold and final, warning that any future disruptions would result in David looking for employment elsewhere. As Tommy walked back toward the break room with his father, he whispered in Mandarin that the German man on the phone had seemed very sad, like he wanted to help but couldn't understand why the American man was being so unfriendly. David explained quietly that sometimes people had different ways of doing business, and that what seemed rude to one person might be normal to another. Tommy nodded seriously, then asked if his father thought the sad man might feel better if someone explained that Americans sometimes spoke differently than they meant to speak. The incident left David feeling exposed and vulnerable, reminded once again of how precarious his position was in this world where his actual qualifications remained hidden beneath the simple necessity of keeping his job. He had spent years building expertise in exactly the kind of cross-cultural communication that Morrison was butchering on a daily basis, yet he was powerless to help, forced to watch valuable business relationships deteriorate due to preventable misunderstandings. That evening, as David completed his cleaning duties on Morrison's floor, he found himself thinking about the phone calls he had overheard, the frustrated clients whose concerns were being dismissed or misunderstood, the deals that were falling apart because of cultural insensitivity masquerading as business acumen. Morrison's office was filled with awards and certificates celebrating his supposed success in international relations, but David could see the growing stack of complaint letters and the increasingly desperate emails from clients who were losing patience with Meridian's approach to global partnerships. Tommy spent the rest of the afternoon in the break room, quietly completing additional homework he had brought from school and occasionally helping Mrs. Rodriguez translate simple phrases from the Spanish language training materials she was updating. The boy's natural ability to switch between languages drew admiring comments from the other staff members, who were amazed by his fluency and impressed by his mature understanding of different cultural contexts. As father and son prepared to leave the building that evening, Tommy asked his father in French why some people seemed angry when other people tried to help them. David considered the question carefully, then explained that sometimes people were afraid of appearing weak or unknowledgeable, so they rejected assistance even when they needed it most. Tommy absorbed this wisdom silently, then observed that it seemed like a very lonely way to live, always having to pretend you knew everything when learning from others could be much more interesting. The elevator descended toward the lobby as David reflected on his son's innocent observation, recognizing the profound truth hidden within Tommy's simple words. Tomorrow would bring another day of watching valuable opportunities slip away due to pride and prejudice, another day of remaining silent while his expertise could have made a real difference in people's lives. As they walked through the marble lobby toward the street, David noticed Tommy listening intently to a conversation between two Korean businessmen who seemed confused about directions to a nearby hotel. Without hesitation, Tommy approached them politely and offered assistance in their native language, providing clear directions while also recommending a good restaurant in their neighborhood. The men's faces lit up with gratitude and surprise at finding such helpful communication from someone so young. David watched this interaction with mixed emotions, proud of his son's natural kindness but also aware that Tommy's abilities were becoming increasingly visible to others in the building. The boy's linguistic gifts were too remarkable to remain hidden much longer, and David knew that their carefully maintained anonymity was becoming more precarious with each demonstration of Tommy's extraordinary capabilities. During their walk home, Tommy switched between languages as they passed different ethnic restaurants and markets, reading signs aloud in Spanish, Italian, and Arabic while asking his father questions about the cultural significance of various foods and customs. David found himself drawing on his academic knowledge to provide context and explanations, their conversation becoming an impromptu cultural studies lesson that reinforced Tommy's natural curiosity about the world around them. The boy's questions revealed a depth of understanding that sometimes startled David, such as when Tommy asked why certain languages used different sentence structures and whether those differences reflected different ways of thinking about relationships between people and objects. David explained basic concepts of linguistic relativity while marveling at his son's intuitive grasp of complex theoretical frameworks that most adults never encountered. As they stopped at their neighborhood grocery store, Tommy helped translate for an elderly Russian woman who was having difficulty communicating with the cashier about a prescription medication she needed to purchase. The woman's relief and gratitude were evident as Tommy facilitated the transaction, and David realized that his son's abilities were becoming a natural part of their community interactions in ways that brought genuine help to people who needed it most. That evening, as David prepared dinner while Tommy completed additional homework assignments, their conversation continued to flow between multiple languages in the natural rhythm that had developed over years of shared learning. David found himself teaching Tommy about diplomatic protocol and international business customs, knowledge that seemed purely academic at the time but would prove invaluable in ways neither of them could have predicted. The day's events had reinforced David's understanding that Tommy's gifts were too significant to remain hidden indefinitely, and that the boy's natural desire to help others would eventually create situations where their abilities would be revealed whether they planned for it or not. The question was not whether their secret would be discovered, but when and under what circumstances that revelation would occur. Their small apartment on the 7th floor of the converted brownstone felt like a sanctuary after the sterile corporate environment of Meridian International. David unlocked the door and breathed in the familiar scent of the jasmine tea he had left steeping that morning, mixed with the lingering aroma of the dumplings they had made together the previous weekend. Tommy immediately dropped his backpack by the door and headed to the kitchen table, which served as both their dining space and his homework station, spreading his books across the worn wooden surface with practiced efficiency. David began preparing their evening meal while Tommy organized his assignments, their conversation flowing naturally between English and Mandarin as they discussed the boys' day at school. Tommy had been selected to help his teacher, Ms. Parker, communicate with a new student from South Korea who spoke very little English. The 80-year-old had spent his lunch period teaching the newcomer basic phrases and playground games, using Korean words he had absorbed from the Korean grocery store owner in their neighborhood. As David chopped vegetables for their stir-fry, he listened to Tommy recount the story of helping young Jin-woo understand the American school system, explaining everything from cafeteria procedures to playground rules. Tommy's natural empathy shone through as he described how scared and lonely the new boy had seemed, how his face had lit up when Tommy greeted him in his native language. David felt the familiar mixture of pride and concern that always accompanied stories of his son's linguistic gifts, knowing that such abilities could be both a blessing and a burden. Tommy pulled out his social studies homework and began reading aloud about different cultures around the world, switching languages as he encountered countries whose native tongues he had been learning. When he reached the section about Japan, he read the English text first, then attempted to translate key concepts into Japanese, his pronunciation carefully considered as he worked through the unfamiliar syllables. David paused in his cooking to listen, amazed once again by his son's intuitive understanding of linguistic patterns. The boy looked up from his textbook and asked his father in Italian why some people at school seemed surprised when he helped translate for other children. David set down his spatula and joined Tommy at the table, switching to Italian as he explained that not everyone had been exposed to multiple languages the way Tommy had been. He told his son about his own childhood, growing up in a household where his grandmother spoke only Mandarin, his parents switched between English and Chinese depending on their mood, and his own curiosity about the world had led him to study linguistics in college. Tommy's eyes widened as his father continued the story, describing his years at Columbia University where he had specialized in diplomatic communication and cross-cultural understanding. David rarely spoke about his academic past, but tonight felt different, perhaps because of the frustrating encounters with Morrison and the growing sense that his son deserved to understand the full truth about their family's capabilities. He explained how he had earned his doctorate, how he had taught undergraduate courses while completing his own research, how his expertise had once been valued and sought after by government agencies and international corporations. The conversation shifted to French as Tommy asked why his father had stopped teaching at the university. David's expression grew more serious as he explained about Tommy's mother, Sarah, and her battle with cancer that had required all of his attention and financial resources. He described the impossible choice between maintaining his academic career and being present for his wife during her final months, how the medical bills had consumed their savings, how the demands of caring for a sick spouse and a young child had made it impossible to meet his teaching obligations. Tommy reached across the table and took his father's hand, switching to Spanish as he told David that he thought his father had made the right choice, that taking care of family was more important than any job. The boy's mature understanding of sacrifice and love touched David deeply, reminding him why he had never regretted the decisions that had led them to their current circumstances. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them like a warm blanket. As they ate dinner together, Tommy asked his father in Portuguese why he didn't tell people at work about his education and experience. David explained that sometimes people made assumptions about others based on their current job rather than their actual capabilities, that revealing his background might create complications or resentment among his co-workers. Tommy nodded thoughtfully, then observed in Russian that it seemed unfair for people to judge others without really knowing them. After dinner, Tommy spread his homework across the table while David graded papers from his online tutoring sessions, a small source of additional income that allowed him to use his linguistic skills while maintaining their primary source of employment. Father and son worked together in companionable silence, occasionally helping each other with particularly challenging problems or sharing interesting discoveries from their respective studies. Tommy looked up from his math homework and asked in German if his father missed teaching at the university. David considered the question carefully, then admitted that he did miss the intellectual stimulation and the satisfaction of helping students discover their own potential. But he added that watching Tommy grow and learn provided a different kind of fulfillment, one that was more personal and meaningful than any academic achievement. The boy brightened and suggested that perhaps someday they could teach together, combining their knowledge to help other people understand different cultures and languages. David smiled at his son's optimism and agreed that it was a beautiful dream, one worth keeping alive even when the future felt uncertain. Tommy returned to his homework with renewed energy, inspired by the possibility that their shared gifts might someday find a proper outlet. As the evening progressed, David helped Tommy practice pronunciation in various languages, correcting his tone in Mandarin and helping him navigate the complex grammar structures of Russian and German. The boy absorbed each lesson eagerly, his young mind processing linguistic patterns with the same ease that other children mastered video games or sports statistics. David marveled at his son's natural ability, recognizing echoes of his own childhood fascination with language and communication. Where in the world are you tonight as you listen to this story of a father and son sharing their hidden gifts in the quiet privacy of their humble home? Perhaps you too understand what it means to possess talents that the world hasn't yet recognized, or maybe you've experienced the profound bond that comes from sharing knowledge and dreams with someone you love unconditionally. Before bedtime, Tommy asked his father to tell him a story in whatever language felt most appropriate for the tale. David chose French and began weaving a narrative about a young boy who could speak to animals in their own languages, helping them solve problems and build bridges between different species. As Tommy drifted off to sleep, David reflected on the strange parallel between his fictional story and their real life, wondering when the world would discover that some of its most valuable treasures were hidden in the most unexpected places. The bedtime routine had become one of David's favorite parts of each day, a time when he could share his love of language and culture with Tommy without the constraints and complications that governed their public interactions. These quiet moments allowed him to pass on not just linguistic knowledge but also the values and perspectives that had shaped his own worldview during his academic years. As David turned off the lights in Tommy's room, he found himself thinking about the choices that lay ahead for his remarkable son. The boy's abilities were growing at a pace that would soon make concealment impossible, and David knew that decisions about Tommy's education and future would need to be made carefully to ensure that his gifts were nurtured rather than exploited. The small apartment felt peaceful in the evening quiet, filled with the comfortable evidence of their shared intellectual life. Books in multiple languages lined the shelves that David had built himself, and Tommy's artwork decorated the walls alongside maps and cultural artifacts that reflected their ongoing exploration of different societies and traditions. David settled into his favorite chair with a cup of tea and the academic journals he still read to maintain his connection to current research in international relations and cross-cultural communication. These publications reminded him of the scholarly community he had once belonged to, and he often found himself mentally composing responses to articles and debates, though he no longer had a platform for sharing his insights with colleagues and students. Sometimes David wondered whether he had made the right choice. In prioritizing Tommy's immediate needs over his own professional ambitions, but moments like tonight's multilingual homework session reassured him that their shared intellectual journey was creating something precious that could never have emerged from a more conventional academic career. Tommy's natural gifts were flourishing in ways that formal educational institutions might have struggled to accommodate. The evening's conversation had revealed new depths in Tommy's understanding of cultural sensitivity and human communication, suggesting that the boy was developing not just linguistic skills but genuine wisdom about the complexities of international relationships. David recognized that his son might eventually surpass his own achievements in cross-cultural understanding, bringing fresh perspectives to challenges that had puzzled scholars and diplomats for generations. As David prepared for bed, he reflected on the day's interactions at Meridian International and the growing tension between his hidden expertise and the cultural disasters he was forced to witness in silence. The company's international relationships were deteriorating due to exactly the kind of cultural insensitivity that his academic research had been designed to prevent, yet his position made it impossible to offer assistance without risking their financial security. The irony of their situation was not lost on David as he considered how his years of enforced invisibility had given him unique insights into the ways that talent and potential could be overlooked by organizations focused on surface appearances rather than deeper capabilities. These observations were shaping his understanding of human resource management and organizational behavior in ways that might prove valuable if he ever had the opportunity to return to academic research. The quiet apartment held the promise of tomorrow's possibilities as David finally settled into sleep, surrounded by the evidence of their shared intellectual life and confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Tommy would face them together with the strength that came from mutual understanding and unconditional love. The emergency meeting notification appeared on every computer screen at Meridian International at exactly 9:37 that Tuesday morning, marked with the red priority flag that meant millions of dollars hung in the balance. David was restocking supplies in the supply closet when he heard the urgent footsteps and hushed conversations that always accompanied a corporate crisis. Through the partially open door, he watched as executives hurried past with grim expressions, their phones pressed to their ears as they attempted to manage what was clearly becoming a significant problem. CEO Maria Rodriguez emerged from the elevator with the controlled urgency of someone accustomed to handling high-stakes situations, but David could see the tension in her shoulders as she strode toward the executive conference room. She had built Meridian International from a small import business into a global powerhouse through her ability to forge partnerships across cultural boundaries, and her reputation for fairness and integrity had made her one of the most respected leaders in international trade. Brad Morrison was already in the conference room when Rodriguez arrived, his face flushed with the particular shade of red that came from trying to explain away a disaster of his own making. Spread across the polished table were contracts, cultural assessment reports, and correspondence that told the story of a partnership gone wrong. The Takahashi Group, one of Japan's most influential technology conglomerates, had been negotiating a $50 million manufacturing agreement with Meridian for the past 6 months, but the deal was now collapsing due to what the Japanese partners described as persistent cultural insensitivity and communication failures. David continued his work in the nearby supply areas, but the raised voices from the conference room made it impossible to ignore the severity of the situation. Morrison was attempting to defend his handling of the negotiations, insisting that the Japanese partners were being unreasonably demanding and that their complaints about cultural misunderstandings were simply excuses to renegotiate more favorable terms. Rodriguez's response was sharp and direct, pointing out that Takahashi Group had terminated 3 previous partnerships with American companies for similar reasons. The crisis had escalated when Kenji Takahashi himself, the company's founder and chairman, had personally called Rodriguez the previous evening to express his disappointment with Morrison's approach. Takahashi had described feeling disrespected and misunderstood throughout the negotiation process, citing specific instances where Morrison had dismissed Japanese business customs as inefficient and had made assumptions about decision-making processes that revealed a fundamental ignorance of Japanese corporate culture. Rodriguez pulled up email correspondence on her laptop and read aloud from Takahashi's formal complaint, which detailed Morrison's failure to understand the importance of consensus building in Japanese business culture, his impatience with what he called unnecessary ceremonial aspects of meetings, and his tendency to interrupt senior Japanese executives in ways that were considered deeply disrespectful. The email concluded with Takahashi's regretful announcement that his company would be withdrawing from negotiations unless Meridian could demonstrate a genuine commitment to cross-cultural understanding. Morrison's defense grew increasingly desperate as Rodriguez presented evidence of his mishandling of the relationship. He had scheduled meetings during Japanese holidays without consulting cultural calendars, had presented gifts that were inappropriate according to Japanese business etiquette, and had consistently addressed junior staff members instead of following proper hierarchical protocols. Most damaging of all, he had made several comments about Japanese efficiency and work culture that had been interpreted as condescending and stereotypical. The financial implications of losing the Takahashi partnership extended far beyond the immediate $50 million contract. Meridian had invested heavily in expanding their manufacturing capabilities to meet the projected demand, and the Takahashi agreement was intended to serve as a gateway to other lucrative partnerships throughout Asia. Rodriguez explained that the company's entire Pacific expansion strategy depended on successfully demonstrating their ability to work respectfully and effectively with Japanese partners. Rodriguez's phone rang with an international number, and she answered to find Takahashi's assistant requesting an immediate conference call to discuss the possibility of salvaging the partnership. The assistant explained that Takahashi was willing to give Meridian one final opportunity to demonstrate their commitment to cultural sensitivity, but only if they could provide a representative who truly understood Japanese business culture and could communicate effectively in both languages and cultural contexts. Morrison immediately volunteered to lead the call, insisting that he could repair the relationship if given another chance. Rodriguez's expression made it clear that she had lost confidence in his abilities, but the urgency of the situation left few alternatives. The company's other executives with international experience were either traveling or committed to equally critical projects, and bringing in an outside consultant at this late stage would likely be interpreted as an admission of incompetence. As David worked quietly in the adjacent areas, he found himself thinking about the conversation he had witnessed, recognizing the cultural missteps that had led to this crisis and understanding exactly what would be required to rebuild trust with Takahashi Group. His years of academic research had included extensive study of Japanese business practices, and his doctoral dissertation had focused specifically on the role of cultural sensitivity in international negotiations. He knew that successful partnerships with Japanese companies required patience, respect for hierarchy, and a deep understanding of the indirect communication styles that Morrison had clearly failed to appreciate. The conference call was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, giving Morrison barely 4 hours to prepare for what might be Meridian's last chance to save the partnership. Rodriguez made it clear that the company's future in Asian markets depended on the outcome of this conversation, and that failure was not an acceptable option. Morrison left the conference room with a stack of cultural briefings and contact information for emergency translation services, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. Tommy arrived at the building that afternoon to find the usually bustling offices subdued with tension. Mrs. Rodriguez from Human Resources seemed distracted and worried as she helped him settle into the break room, explaining that everyone was focused on an important business call that could determine the company's future. Tommy immediately picked up on the stress in her voice and asked if there was anything he could do to help, his natural instinct to offer assistance shining through despite his young age. As the afternoon progressed and the crucial conference call approached, David continued his maintenance duties while keeping one eye on the crisis unfolding around him. He watched Morrison pace nervously outside the conference room, rehearsing phrases from a pronunciation guide and struggling with basic Japanese expressions that sounded forced and unnatural. The sight filled David with a mixture of frustration and sadness, knowing that the failure of this partnership would hurt not just Meridian International, but also the dedicated employees whose jobs depended on the company's continued success in global markets. The conference call with Takahashi Group began precisely at 2 o'clock, with Morrison seated at the head of the polished table while Rodriguez and 3 other senior executives listened from their positions around the room. The large monitor displayed the faces of 5 Japanese executives, including the stern visage of Kenji Takahashi himself, whose expression conveyed the gravity of this final opportunity for reconciliation. Morrison had spent the past 4 hours cramming cultural etiquette guidelines and practicing pronunciation, but his nervousness was evident in the way his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through his hastily prepared notes. David was cleaning the conference room's adjacent hallway when Morrison's voice carried through the partially open door, immediately revealing the same cultural tone deafness that had created this crisis in the first place. Morrison began the call by addressing Takahashi directly rather than following proper Japanese protocol of acknowledging the most senior person present, then compounded his error by mispronouncing Takahashi's name and using an inappropriately casual tone that would have been acceptable in American business culture but was deeply disrespectful in the Japanese context. Takahashi's response was politely measured, but David could hear the underlying disappointment in his carefully modulated words. The Japanese executive explained that his company valued long-term relationships built on mutual respect and understanding, and that successful partnerships required more than just financial agreements. He emphasized that Japanese business culture prioritized harmony and consensus building, concepts that seemed to have been overlooked during previous negotiations. Morrison's reply demonstrated that he had learned nothing from the cultural briefings Rodriguez had provided. He interrupted Takahashi mid-sentence to argue that American efficiency and directness were actually advantages in global business, suggesting that Japanese decision-making processes were unnecessarily complicated and time-consuming. The silence that followed Morrison's comments was so profound that David could practically feel the embarrassment radiating from the conference room. Rodriguez attempted to salvage the conversation by apologizing for Morrison's approach and suggesting that perhaps they could discuss specific concerns about the manufacturing timeline. However, Morrison immediately jumped back into the conversation, contradicting his own CEO and insisting that the original timeline was perfectly reasonable. He went on to suggest that Takahashi Group's concerns about cultural sensitivity were simply delaying tactics designed to extract better financial terms. The Japanese executives exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about their assessment of Morrison's character and competence. Takahashi himself remained diplomatically silent, but his deputy, Hiroshi Yamamoto, began explaining in careful English why the partnership was becoming untenable. Yamamoto described how Morrison's previous emails had contained assumptions about Japanese work culture that were both inaccurate and offensive, including suggestions that Japanese employees were less innovative than their American counterparts. Morrison's response to these legitimate concerns was to become defensive and argumentative, insisting that his comments had been taken out of context and that the Japanese team was being overly sensitive. He suggested that successful international business required all parties to adapt to American standards of communication, completely missing the irony that this attitude was precisely what had created the crisis in the first place. Rodriguez's expression grew increasingly pained as she watched Morrison systematically destroy any remaining possibility of salvaging the partnership. David found himself pausing in his cleaning duties as he listened to Morrison's continued cultural blunders. The man was not only failing to address Takahashi's concerns but was actively making the situation worse with every word. David knew from his academic research that Japanese business culture valued humility and acknowledgement of mistakes as the first step toward rebuilding trust, but Morrison seemed incapable of admitting any wrongdoing on his part. Takahashi finally spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of finality as he explained that his company had hoped this conversation would demonstrate Meridian's commitment to understanding and respecting their business culture. Instead, he had witnessed the same attitudes and assumptions that had made their partnership impossible from the beginning. He thanked Rodriguez for her time and began the formal process of withdrawing from all negotiations, expressing regret that circumstances had not allowed for a more positive outcome. Morrison made one last desperate attempt to save the deal by offering additional financial concessions, but his failure to understand that money could not repair the damage done to the relationship only reinforced Takahashi's decision. The Japanese executive politely but firmly declined any further negotiations, stating that his company would be exploring partnerships with organizations that demonstrated greater cultural awareness and sensitivity. As the call ended with formal expressions of mutual respect that barely concealed the underlying disappointment, Rodriguez's anger was evident in the controlled precision of her movements as she closed her laptop and gathered her papers. Morrison immediately began defending his performance, arguing that the Japanese executives had been unreasonable and that their decision was based on cultural preferences rather than business merit. Rodriguez's response was swift and unambiguous, informing Morrison that his handling of the Takahashi relationship had cost the company not only $50 million but also their credibility in Asian markets. The aftermath of the failed call sent ripples of anxiety throughout the building as news of the lost partnership spread among the staff. David observed the worried conversations and hushed speculation about potential layoffs, knowing that the failure to secure this crucial deal would have consequences far beyond Morrison's damaged reputation. Rodriguez spent the remainder of the afternoon in emergency meetings with the board of directors, attempting to develop strategies for minimizing the financial impact and explaining to investors how such a promising partnership had deteriorated so completely. Morrison retreated to his office with the defeated posture of someone who knew his career at Meridian International was effectively over. His attempts to blame the failure on Japanese inflexibility had fallen on deaf ears, and Rodriguez had made it clear that his approach to international relations was fundamentally incompatible with the company's values and objectives. The stack of complaint letters from other international partners that had accumulated on his desk over the past year suddenly seemed like evidence of a pattern rather than isolated incidents. Tommy spent the afternoon in the break room, working on his homework while sensing the tension that permeated the building. Mrs. Rodriguez from Human Resources seemed distracted and worried, occasionally taking phone calls that clearly involved discussions about the failed partnership. Tommy could hear fragments of conversations in multiple languages as international staff members discussed the situation, and his natural linguistic curiosity led him to understand more about the crisis than most adults realized. As the day drew to a close, David reflected on the tragic waste he had witnessed, knowing that the cultural misunderstandings that had destroyed this partnership were entirely preventable. His academic expertise in cross-cultural communication could have identified and addressed Morrison's mistakes before they became irreparable damage, but his position as a maintenance worker meant that his knowledge remained invisible and unused. The irony of cleaning up after disasters he could have prevented was not lost on him as he methodically restored order to the conference room where $50 million had vanished due to ignorance and arrogance. The failed conference call had created a crisis atmosphere that permeated every level of the organization, from the boardroom where Rodriguez was fielding angry calls from investors to the break room where administrative staff worried about potential layoffs. David observed these worried conversations as he continued his cleaning duties, understanding better than anyone the cascading consequences that would follow from this cultural disaster. Morrison's office had become a fortress of denial as he spent the evening writing reports that attempted to shift blame for the partnership's failure onto Takahashi Group's supposed unreasonableness and cultural inflexibility. David could see through the glass walls as Morrison crafted explanations that completely missed the point about respect and cultural sensitivity, instead focusing on contractual terms and business efficiency arguments that only reinforced his fundamental misunderstanding of Japanese values. Rodriguez worked late into the evening, her office lights visible from the hallway as she attempted to develop damage control strategies that might salvage some possibility of future partnerships in Asian markets. David knew from his academic research that rebuilding trust after such a public cultural failure would require years of patient relationship building and authentic demonstration of changed attitudes, assuming it was possible at all. The ripple effects of the disaster were already spreading through the business community as word of Meridian's cultural insensitivity reached other potential partners who had been considering similar agreements. David overheard phone conversations where international contacts expressed concern about proceeding with negotiations, creating a cascade of cancelled meetings and postponed discussions that threatened to isolate the company from lucrative global opportunities. Tommy had spent the afternoon quietly observing the building's tense atmosphere, his natural empathy making him sensitive to the worry and frustration that seemed to emanate from every office and conference room. The boy's linguistic abilities allowed him to understand fragments of conversations in multiple languages as international staff members discussed the crisis, giving him insights into the global implications of Morrison's failures that most adults in the building did not possess. The security staff and cleaning crews were among the few employees whose jobs seemed secure regardless of the partnership disaster, but even they understood that the company's financial difficulties would eventually affect everyone if the situation could not be resolved. David found himself in conversations with colleagues who expressed bewilderment about how such an important deal could have fallen apart so completely, though none of them suspected that their quiet maintenance supervisor possessed the expertise to explain exactly what had gone wrong. The evening news programs carried brief reports about Meridian's failed partnership, focusing on the financial implications rather than the cultural issues that had caused the breakdown. David watched these reports in the employee break room, recognizing the superficial analysis that characterized most media coverage of international business disputes while understanding the deeper cultural dynamics that reporters and analysts typically overlooked. Rodriguez's assistant confirmed that several other Asian companies had postponed or canceled planned meetings with Meridian representatives, indicating that the damage from the Takahashi disaster was spreading beyond the immediate partnership to affect the company's broader reputation in international markets. The assistant's worried expression reflected the growing understanding that this crisis could not be resolved through traditional business approaches. As David completed his cleaning duties and prepared to collect Tommy for their journey home, he reflected on the painful irony of witnessing disasters that his expertise could have prevented while being powerless to offer assistance due to the social and economic constraints that governed their carefully hidden life. The knowledge that genuine cultural understanding could have created tremendous value for everyone involved made the waste and destruction even more difficult to bear. The building gradually emptied as employees departed with worried expressions and uncertain prospects, leaving behind the evidence of a corporate crisis that had transformed a promising international partnership into a cautionary tale about the costs of cultural arrogance and the importance of authentic respect in global business relationships. The emergency board meeting that evening stretched past 9 o'clock as Rodriguez attempted to explain to increasingly agitated investors how Meridian International had lost its most promising Asian partnership in a single disastrous phone call. The financial projections that had looked so promising just 24 hours earlier now represented a gaping hole in the company's expansion strategy, and the ripple effects were already being felt throughout the organization. David worked quietly in the adjacent offices, overhearing fragments of heated discussions about damage control and the urgent need to find alternative partnerships before word of the Takahashi failure spread throughout the industry. Rodriguez emerged from the boardroom with the exhausted expression of someone who had spent hours defending decisions she had not made, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the stress that came with explaining corporate disasters to people who measured success purely in financial terms. The board had given her 72 hours to develop a recovery plan, but everyone in the room understood that some opportunities, once lost, could never be fully recovered. The Asian market that Meridian had worked years to enter was now effectively closed to them, at least for the foreseeable future. Morrison's termination became official the following morning, but his departure only highlighted the magnitude of the crisis rather than solving it. Rodriguez found herself facing the impossible task of rebuilding relationships that had taken months to establish, with international partners who had already heard about Meridian's cultural insensitivity through the informal networks that connected businesses across continents. The technology industry was particularly unforgiving when it came to reputational damage, and companies like Takahashi Group shared information about problematic partners as readily as they shared recommendations for reliable ones. The situation deteriorated further when Rodriguez received a call from Chinwei Industries, another major Asian conglomerate that had been considering a partnership with Meridian. Chinwei's representative explained that they had heard about the Takahashi situation and were concerned about proceeding with any agreements until Meridian could demonstrate genuine commitment to cross-cultural understanding. Similar calls came from potential partners in South Korea and Thailand, creating a cascade of cancelled meetings and postponed negotiations that threatened to undermine years of relationship-building efforts. By Wednesday afternoon, Rodriguez was facing what appeared to be an insurmountable challenge. The company's reputation in Asian markets was damaged beyond easy repair, their primary pathway to international expansion had been blocked, and the financial consequences were already affecting stock prices and employee morale. She sat in her office staring at a list of international contacts, trying to identify anyone who might be willing to take a meeting with Meridian despite the growing reputation for cultural insensitivity. David was restocking supplies in the executive floor when he noticed Rodriguez working late again, her desk covered with cultural training materials and international business guides that she was clearly studying in preparation for damage control efforts. The sight filled him with a familiar frustration, knowing that his expertise could provide exactly the kind of guidance she needed but having no way to offer assistance without revealing his hidden background and risking his employment. Tommy had been observing the building's tense atmosphere with the perceptive awareness that children often possess, noticing that the adults around him seemed worried and distracted. Mrs. Rodriguez from Human Resources had explained in simple terms that the company was having difficulties with some important business partners, and Tommy had connected this information with the fragments of conversation he had overheard in multiple languages throughout the week. The crisis reached its peak on Thursday morning when Rodriguez received an unexpected call from Kenji Takahashi himself. Speaking in heavily accented but precise English, Takahashi explained that he had been reconsidering his decision to terminate their partnership, not because he had changed his mind about Morrison's behavior, but because he had heard positive things about Rodriguez personally from mutual contacts in the industry. He was willing to consider one final meeting, but only if Meridian could provide a representative who demonstrated genuine understanding of Japanese culture and could communicate effectively in both English and Japanese. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope mixed with desperation as she realized that this unexpected second chance might be their only opportunity to salvage not just the Takahashi partnership but their entire Asian expansion strategy. However, her relief quickly turned to anxiety as she considered her limited options for finding someone with the necessary cultural expertise and language skills. The company's other international specialists were either unavailable or lacked sufficient knowledge of Japanese business culture, and hiring an outside consultant at this late stage would likely be seen as evidence of Meridian's ongoing incompetence. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, giving Rodriguez less than 24 hours to find a qualified representative and prepare for what would essentially be Meridian's final opportunity to prove their worthiness as a partner. She spent Thursday evening calling every contact in her professional network, searching for someone who could handle the cultural complexities of rebuilding trust with Japanese partners while also understanding Meridian's business objectives and capabilities. As Thursday night turned into Friday morning, Rodriguez found herself facing the very real possibility that this unprecedented second chance would be wasted simply because she could not locate anyone with the necessary qualifications on such short notice. Professional translation services could handle the language barrier, but what Takahashi was requesting went far beyond simple translation to encompass deep cultural understanding and the ability to rebuild damaged relationships through authentic respect and sensitivity. Have you ever witnessed a moment when everything hung in the balance, when years of work and planning could be destroyed or saved by a single conversation? Perhaps you understand what it feels like to watch opportunities slip away due to circumstances beyond your control, or maybe you have experienced the desperate search for solutions when time is running out and options are disappearing. David arrived for his Friday morning shift to find the building buzzing with nervous energy as word spread about the unexpected reprieve from Takahashi Group and the impossible challenge of finding a qualified representative. He observed Rodriguez's increasingly frantic phone calls and recognized the growing desperation in her voice as she exhausted her list of potential contacts without finding anyone who could meet Takahashi's requirements. Tommy settled into the break room that morning with his usual homework and books, but his attention was drawn to the worried conversations happening throughout the building. He could hear people speaking in multiple languages about the crisis, and his natural linguistic curiosity led him to understand far more about the situation than most adults realized. As he worked on his assignments, Tommy found himself thinking about the sad voices he had heard on previous phone calls and wondering if there might be some way to help the kind people who had been so welcoming to him during his after-school hours in their building. The clock on Rodriguez's office wall showed 11:30, and the crucial meeting with Takahashi was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Time was running out, and Meridian International's future in international markets hung in the balance, waiting for a miracle that seemed increasingly unlikely to arrive. The morning brought no relief from the mounting pressure as Rodriguez exhausted her final list of potential contacts without finding anyone who could meet Takahashi's demanding requirements for cultural expertise and language proficiency. Professional translation services could handle basic communication, but what Takahashi was requesting went far beyond simple language conversion to encompass deep understanding of Japanese business culture and the diplomatic skills necessary to rebuild damaged relationships. Rodriguez's desperation was evident in her increasingly frantic phone calls to academic institutions, consulting firms, and cultural organizations, searching for anyone who might be available on such impossibly short notice. The responses were uniformly discouraging, with most experts either unavailable or lacking the specific combination of Japanese language skills and international business experience that would be necessary for success. The crisis had attracted attention from the financial media, with business reporters calling to inquire about rumors of partnership difficulties and their potential impact on Meridian's stock price and expansion plans. Rodriguez's assistant was deflecting these calls while trying to maintain the appearance of business as usual, but the pressure of media scrutiny added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Tommy had arrived at the building that morning with his usual homework and books, but his sensitive nature made him acutely aware of the tension that seemed to permeate every conversation and interaction. The boy's natural curiosity led him to listen more carefully to the worried discussions happening throughout the offices, and his linguistic abilities allowed him to understand fragments of conversations in multiple languages as staff members discussed the developing crisis. Mrs. Rodriguez from Human Resources was struggling to maintain normal operations while dealing with the uncertainty that was affecting employee morale throughout the building. She had explained to Tommy in simple terms that the company was facing some difficulties with important business partners, but the boy's intelligence and observational skills allowed him to piece together a more complete understanding of the situation than most adults realized. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting for late morning, adding pressure on Rodriguez to provide concrete solutions rather than explanations about the challenges she was facing. The financial implications of losing the Takahashi partnership were becoming clearer as analysts calculated the impact on projected revenues and the company's ability to service its expansion-related debt obligations. David observed the mounting crisis with growing frustration, knowing that his expertise could provide exactly the kind of guidance that Rodriguez desperately needed but having no way to offer assistance without revealing his hidden background and potentially jeopardizing their financial security. The sight of valuable opportunities being lost due to preventable cultural failures was particularly painful for someone whose academic career had been dedicated to solving exactly these types of problems. The building's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the crucial meeting time approached, with employees throughout the organization understanding that their futures were somehow connected to the outcome of a conversation that none of them fully understood. The weight of collective anxiety created an almost physical presence that seemed to press down on everyone who entered the building. Rodriguez's office had become a command center for the crisis, with phone calls, emails, and documents spread across every available surface as she attempted to coordinate last-minute solutions while simultaneously preparing for what might be a futile final conversation with Takahashi Group. The controlled desperation in her movements reflected the impossible challenge of trying to accomplish in hours what should have taken months of careful preparation and relationship building. Tommy Chen finished his math homework at exactly 12:15 and looked up to see Mrs. Rodriguez from Human Resources pacing anxiously near the break room door, her phone pressed to her ear as she made what sounded like another unsuccessful attempt to find help for the afternoon's crucial meeting. The 80-year-old had been listening to the worried conversations all morning, and his natural empathy was stirred by the obvious distress of the adults around him. He approached Mrs. Rodriguez quietly and waited for her to finish her call before asking in his polite, careful way if there was anything he could do to help with the problem everyone seemed so worried about. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled sadly at Tommy's offer, explaining that the company needed someone who could speak Japanese very well and understand Japanese business culture for an important meeting, but that they had been unable to find anyone qualified on such short notice. Tommy's face brightened with genuine excitement as he told her that he had been learning Japanese from Mr. Tanaka, the elderly man who ran the small restaurant near their apartment building, and that he had been practicing with some of the Japanese businessmen he occasionally met in the building's lobby. The human resources manager's expression shifted from polite dismissal to curious attention as Tommy began speaking in fluent Japanese, explaining that he understood this was a very important meeting and that he had been sad to hear the worried voices of people discussing the problem. His pronunciation was remarkably accurate, and his understanding of formal speech patterns demonstrated a sophistication that seemed impossible for someone his age. Mrs. Rodriguez stared at the boy in amazement, then hurried toward the executive floor to find CEO Rodriguez. Maria Rodriguez was in her office making yet another desperate phone call when Mrs. Rodriguez knocked urgently on her door, followed by a small boy whose presence in the executive area would normally have violated several security protocols. Tommy stood quietly beside the desk while Mrs. Rodriguez explained what she had just witnessed, but Rodriguez remained skeptical until Tommy himself began speaking in Japanese, introducing himself with perfect formal etiquette and expressing his sincere desire to help resolve the difficulties between the two companies. Rodriguez's phone slipped from her hand as she listened to Tommy's flawless Japanese, his words carrying not just linguistic accuracy but genuine cultural understanding as he explained that he had been learning about Japanese business customs and believed that respect and patience were the most important elements in building successful partnerships. The boy's earnest demeanor and obvious intelligence were impressive enough, but his sophisticated grasp of diplomatic language and cultural nuances seemed to transcend his years in ways that defied easy explanation. Tommy continued speaking in Japanese, explaining that he had overheard some of the previous conversations and understood that Mr. Takahashi felt disrespected and misunderstood. He suggested that perhaps a sincere apology combined with demonstration of genuine cultural awareness might help rebuild the trust that had been damaged. His words carried the wisdom of someone who instinctively understood that successful relationships required acknowledgement of mistakes and commitment to doing better in the future. Rodriguez found herself leaning forward as Tommy switched to English to explain that his father had taught him about different cultures and languages, and that he had always been interested in helping people understand each other better. The boy's natural diplomatic instincts were evident as he suggested specific approaches for addressing Takahashi's concerns, demonstrating an understanding of Japanese business culture that surpassed what Morrison had managed to learn in months of preparation. When Rodriguez asked Tommy where he had acquired such sophisticated knowledge of Japanese business practices, the boy explained that he had been reading books about different countries and their customs, and that Mr. Tanaka had been teaching him not just the language but also the proper ways to show respect in Japanese culture. Tommy's explanation revealed a level of cultural curiosity and learning that impressed Rodriguez even more than his linguistic abilities. David arrived on the executive floor to find his son engaged in serious conversation with the CEO, speaking alternately in Japanese and English as he discussed complex international business concepts with the confidence of someone far beyond his years. The sight filled David with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that Tommy's abilities were now being revealed in ways that could change their lives dramatically. Rodriguez looked up at David with an expression of amazement and growing hope, realizing that the solution to her crisis might have been working quietly in her building all along. Rodriguez asked Tommy if he would be willing to help with the important phone call that afternoon, explaining that Mr. Takahashi was giving them one last chance to prove that they could be respectful partners. Tommy's face lit up with enthusiasm as he agreed, then demonstrated his understanding of the situation by switching to Japanese and practicing the formal apologies and expressions of respect that would be necessary to begin rebuilding the damaged relationship. As Rodriguez listened to Tommy's preparations, she began to understand that this remarkable child possessed not just linguistic skills but genuine diplomatic instincts that could potentially salvage the partnership that Morrison had destroyed. Tommy's natural empathy and cultural sensitivity, combined with his obvious intelligence and respect for others, represented exactly the kind of authentic approach that Takahashi had been seeking from the beginning. David watched his son's enthusiastic preparations with growing amazement, recognizing that Tommy was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded even his own expectations. The boy's natural ability to absorb and apply cultural knowledge, combined with his intuitive understanding of human nature and diplomatic communication, suggested talents that could open doors neither of them had previously imagined. Rodriguez spent the next hour working with Tommy to understand the specifics of Meridian's business proposal and the cultural context that would be necessary for successful communication with Takahashi Group. Tommy absorbed the information quickly and began suggesting modifications to their approach that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Japanese decision-making processes and the importance of building consensus rather than simply presenting facts and figures. As the crucial 2 o'clock meeting approached, Rodriguez found herself feeling more optimistic than she had since the crisis began. Tommy's presence offered not just a potential solution to their immediate problem but hope for a fundamentally different approach to international partnerships, one based on genuine cultural understanding rather than assumptions and stereotypes. The boy's natural gifts seemed to represent everything that Morrison had lacked, suggesting that sometimes the most unlikely solutions could emerge from the most unexpected sources. David stood quietly beside his son as Tommy prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his young life, knowing that the next hour would determine not just Meridian's future but also whether the world would finally recognize the extraordinary abilities that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. The moment they had both been unconsciously preparing for had arrived, and Tommy was ready to show everyone what genuine cross-cultural communication could accomplish when practiced with respect, intelligence, and authentic caring for others. The transformation in Rodriguez's demeanor was remarkable as she witnessed Tommy's preparation, shifting from desperate anxiety to cautious optimism as she began to understand that this remarkable child might actually possess the skills necessary to salvage their crisis. Tommy's natural confidence and obvious cultural sensitivity provided a stark contrast to Morrison's aggressive ignorance, representing everything that the previous approach had lacked. Rodriguez spent additional time briefing Tommy on the specific business details that would be relevant to the conversation, explaining Meridian's manufacturing capabilities and the technical requirements that Takahashi Group was seeking to fulfill. Tommy absorbed this information with remarkable speed, asking intelligent questions that demonstrated his understanding of both the business and cultural aspects of the partnership. David found himself in the unusual position of watching his son prepare to use abilities that exceeded even his own expectations, recognizing that Tommy's natural diplomatic instincts and cultural sensitivity might actually be superior to what formal training and academic study typically produced. The boy's authentic empathy and genuine respect for others created a foundation for cross-cultural communication that was impossible to fake or manufacture through conventional business education. The few staff members who became aware of Tommy's planned participation in the crucial call reacted with mixtures of amazement and skepticism, struggling to believe that an 80-year-old child could possess the sophisticated skills necessary for high-level international diplomacy. However, those who had observed Tommy's linguistic abilities and cultural understanding over the past months found themselves hoping that his remarkable gifts might indeed provide the solution they desperately needed. Rodriguez arranged for the call to take place in the executive conference room with its advanced video equipment and professional audio systems, ensuring that technical difficulties would not interfere with what might be their only opportunity to rebuild the damaged relationship. Tommy examined the equipment with obvious interest, asking questions about how the technology worked while demonstrating the same careful attention to detail that characterized his approach to cultural protocols. The pressure of the impending conversation weighed heavily on everyone involved, but Tommy seemed remarkably calm and focused as he reviewed his notes about Japanese business customs and practiced the formal expressions that would be necessary for addressing Takahashi with appropriate respect. His preparation demonstrated a level of cultural sophistication that would have impressed academic experts in international relations. David realized that this moment represented a turning point not just for their professional circumstances but for their entire approach to living in the world, recognizing that Tommy's intervention would make it impossible to maintain their previous anonymity and invisibility. The boy's extraordinary demonstration would inevitably lead to questions about his background and education that would require David to reveal his own hidden expertise. As the crucial 2 o'clock meeting time approached, Rodriguez found hers. Feeling more optimistic than she had since the crisis began, though she remained acutely aware that they were placing enormous responsibility on the shoulders of a child whose remarkable abilities remained largely untested in high-stakes professional situations. The combination of hope and anxiety created a tension that was palpable throughout the executive floor. The final minutes before the call were spent in careful preparation and review, with Tommy demonstrating his mastery of Japanese business protocols while David provided subtle guidance based on his academic knowledge of diplomatic communication. Their partnership created a unique combination of natural talent and scholarly expertise that offered the best possible chance for success in what many considered an impossible situation. Rodriguez turned to David with questions evident in her eyes, needing to understand how a maintenance worker's 80-year-old son had acquired diplomatic skills that surpassed those of her former international relations director. David felt the weight of years of hidden truth pressing against his chest as he realized that Tommy's intervention had made concealment impossible. His son's extraordinary demonstration had opened a door that could not be closed, and the explanations that followed would change everything about their carefully constructed life of invisibility. David began speaking quietly, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to academic discourse as he explained that Tommy's abilities were not accidental but the result of growing up in a household where multiple languages and cultural studies had been part of daily life. Rodriguez listened with growing amazement as David revealed his background as Dr. David Chen, former head of the International Relations Department at Columbia University, specialist in cross-cultural communication and diplomatic linguistics. The revelation transformed Rodriguez's understanding of everything she had observed over the past year, explaining the quiet dignity with which David approached his work and the sophisticated insights Tommy had demonstrated about cultural sensitivity. David described his doctoral research in diplomatic communication, his years of teaching undergraduate and graduate courses in international relations, and his expertise in the precise kind of cross-cultural bridge building that Morrison had failed so catastrophically to understand. Rodriguez asked why someone with such qualifications was working as a maintenance worker, and David's expression grew more serious as he explained about Sarah's illness and the impossible choices that had followed her cancer diagnosis. He described how the medical bills had consumed their savings, how the demands of caring for a dying spouse and young child had made it impossible to maintain his academic career, and how the practical necessity of supporting Tommy had led him to accept whatever employment was available. Tommy listened to his father's explanation with the solemn attention of a child who was beginning to understand the full scope of the sacrifices that had been made on his behalf. David continued his story, describing how he had deliberately chosen invisible work that would allow him to be present for Tommy while avoiding the professional complications that might arise if his academic background became known. The maintenance position had provided steady income and health insurance while allowing him to remain close to his son during the crucial years following Sarah's death. Rodriguez realized that she had been employing one of the country's leading experts in international relations to clean her offices while watching Morrison destroy valuable partnerships through ignorance and cultural insensitivity. The irony was both tragic and infuriating, representing a waste of talent that had cost the company millions of dollars and nearly destroyed their prospects for international expansion. She asked David why he had never mentioned his background or offered to help with international negotiations. David explained that revealing his qualifications would have created uncomfortable situations for everyone involved, potentially generating resentment among colleagues and raising questions about his motives for accepting maintenance work. He had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of being overqualified for his position by maintaining complete discretion about his background and focusing solely on providing for Tommy's needs. The academic world he had left behind felt like a previous life, separated from his current reality by grief and practical necessity. Rodriguez asked about Tommy's remarkable abilities, and David's expression filled with pride as he described his son's natural gift for languages and cultural understanding. Tommy had absorbed his father's academic knowledge through daily conversations and bedtime stories, developing an intuitive grasp of linguistic patterns and cultural nuances that exceeded what most adults achieve through formal study. The boy's empathy and intelligence had allowed him to synthesize complex concepts about human communication and apply them with wisdom that seemed to transcend his years. David revealed that Tommy spoke 7 languages fluently and had basic conversational ability in 4 others, skills that had developed naturally through exposure to the diverse community around their apartment building and the international environment of Meridian's offices. The boy's linguistic abilities were matched by his sophisticated understanding of cultural differences and his natural diplomatic instincts, qualities that made him uniquely qualified to handle the kind of sensitive international communication that the current crisis required. Rodriguez began to understand that the solution to her company's problems had been working quietly in her building for years, hidden beneath assumptions about job titles and social status that had prevented her from recognizing extraordinary talent. She asked David if he would be willing to help with the Takahashi situation, not just as Tommy's father but as a qualified expert whose knowledge could guide their approach to rebuilding the damaged relationship. David hesitated, torn between his desire to help and his concern about the complications that would arise from revealing his true capabilities. He had spent years protecting his family by maintaining their anonymity, and stepping into a visible role would require abandoning the careful invisibility that had allowed them to survive. Rodriguez sensed his internal conflict and assured him that his expertise would be valued and respected, that Meridian needed people like him to guide their international relationships. Tommy looked up at his father with encouraging eyes, sensing that this moment represented an opportunity for David to use his gifts in ways that had been impossible since Sarah's death. The boy's natural wisdom helped him understand that sometimes hiding one's abilities was necessary for survival, but that there were also moments when those abilities needed to be shared for the benefit of others. He told his father in Mandarin that he thought helping the sad people would be the right thing to do. Rodriguez realized that she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the discovery of hidden talent but the emergence of a father-son team whose combined abilities could transform Meridian's approach to international business. Tommy's natural diplomatic gifts, supported by David's academic expertise and cultural knowledge, represented exactly the kind of authentic cross-cultural understanding that companies like Takahashi Group were seeking in their American partners. David made the decision that would change their lives, agreeing to help with the immediate crisis while acknowledging that his involvement would make it impossible to return to their previous anonymity. Rodriguez assured him that his expertise would be properly recognized and compensated, that Meridian would be honored to have someone with his qualifications guiding their international relationships. The conversation marked the end of David's hidden years and the beginning of a new chapter where his talents would finally find their proper outlet. As the crucial meeting time approached, David began briefing Rodriguez on the cultural protocols and communication strategies that would be necessary for successful engagement with Takahashi Group. His academic knowledge combined with Tommy's intuitive diplomatic skills created a powerful partnership that offered hope for not just salvaging the damaged relationship but establishing a foundation for genuine long-term collaboration based on mutual respect and understanding. The revelation of David's background had fundamentally changed Rodriguez's understanding of the crisis and its potential solutions, transforming what had seemed like an impossible challenge into a complex but manageable problem that could be addressed through proper expertise and cultural sensitivity. David's scholarly knowledge provided the theoretical framework while Tommy's natural abilities offered the authentic emotional connection that would be necessary for rebuilding trust. Rodriguez realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her business experience, the discovery of extraordinary talent hidden within her own organization combined with the emergence of diplomatic capabilities that seemed to transcend normal expectations for someone Tommy's age. The father-son partnership represented a unique resource that could potentially transform Meridian's entire approach to international business development. David's explanation of his academic research helped Rodriguez understand why Morrison's approach had been so catastrophically unsuccessful, providing context for the cultural failures that had seemed puzzling from a purely business perspective. The scholarly framework for cross-cultural communication revealed that successful international partnerships required patience, respect, and genuine understanding rather than aggressive sales tactics and cultural assumptions. The conversation about David's hidden background had also revealed the human cost of corporate hiring practices that relied on surface appearances rather than deeper qualifications, highlighting how assumptions about job titles and social status could prevent organizations from recognizing and utilizing their most valuable human resources. Rodriguez began to understand that Meridian had been wasting talent on a scale that had cost them millions of dollars in lost opportunities. Tommy's presence during this discussion. Ion provided a living demonstration of how cultural gifts could develop naturally in supportive environments, showing that linguistic abilities and diplomatic skills could emerge from authentic curiosity and respect for others rather than formal training programs. The boy's remarkable capabilities suggested that cross-cultural understanding was as much about attitude and empathy as it was about technical knowledge. David's willingness to reveal his expertise despite the personal risks involved demonstrated the depth of his commitment to helping others and his understanding that some opportunities required courage even when the consequences were uncertain. His decision to step forward represented a choice between continued safety and the possibility of using his gifts to create value for everyone involved in the crisis. Rodriguez began to envision how David's expertise could be integrated into Meridian's long-term strategy for international development, recognizing that authentic cultural competence could provide competitive advantages that would be impossible for other companies to replicate through conventional business approaches. The combination of scholarly knowledge and practical experience offered a foundation for sustainable global partnerships. The discussion had also revealed Tommy's potential role as a cultural ambassador and diplomatic facilitator, suggesting that his natural abilities could be nurtured and developed in ways that would benefit both his own growth and Meridian's international relationships. The boy's enthusiasm for helping others communicate effectively indicated that he would thrive in environments that valued cross-cultural understanding and cooperation. As they prepared for the crucial conversation with Takahashi Group, David and Tommy represented hope for a fundamentally different approach to international business, one based on genuine respect and authentic cultural understanding rather than assumptions and stereotypes that had characterized Morrison's failed efforts. The conference call began at precisely 2 o'clock with Kenji Takahashi's face appearing on the large monitor, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes reflecting the skepticism of someone who had been disappointed too many times by American companies promising cultural sensitivity they did not possess. Rodriguez sat at the head of the table with David beside her, while Tommy occupied a chair that had been adjusted to accommodate his small stature, his posture reflecting the seriousness with which he approached this crucial conversation. Tommy began the call by greeting Takahashi in perfect formal Japanese, introducing himself with the elaborate courtesy protocols that demonstrated immediate respect for hierarchy and proper business etiquette. His words carried not just linguistic accuracy but genuine cultural understanding as he acknowledged Takahashi's status and expressed sincere appreciation for the opportunity to address the misunderstandings that had damaged their potential partnership. The Japanese executive's eyebrows rose slightly at hearing such sophisticated language from someone so young. David followed Tommy's greeting with his own carefully structured introduction in Japanese, identifying himself as Dr. David Chen and explaining his background in international relations and cross-cultural communication. He spoke with the measured dignity of someone accustomed to academic discourse while demonstrating profound respect for Japanese business culture through his choice of honorific language and deferential tone. Takahashi's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest as he recognized authentic expertise and cultural sensitivity. Tommy took the lead in addressing the previous failures, speaking in Japanese with remarkable maturity as he acknowledged that Morrison's approach had been disrespectful and culturally insensitive. His words carried genuine remorse without making excuses, demonstrating understanding that successful relationships required acknowledgement of mistakes and commitment to fundamental change. Takahashi listened intently, clearly impressed by the boy's sophisticated grasp of diplomatic communication and authentic cultural awareness. David provided context for Tommy's apology by explaining in Japanese how Meridian International was committed to rebuilding their approach to international partnerships based on genuine respect and cultural understanding. He described specific changes the company would implement to ensure that future communications honored Japanese business customs and decision-making processes. His academic expertise allowed him to address Takahashi's concerns with precision and depth that had been completely absent from Morrison's crude attempts at relationship building. Takahashi responded in Japanese, expressing surprise at finding such authentic cultural understanding after his previous disappointing experiences with American companies. He explained that his primary concern had never been the specific terms of their business agreement but rather the fundamental question of whether Meridian truly respected Japanese values and business practices. Tommy's demonstration of genuine cultural sensitivity had addressed his deepest concerns about the partnership. Tommy seized the opportunity to demonstrate his understanding of Japanese consensus-building culture by asking Takahashi about his company's internal decision-making processes and expressing genuine interest in learning how Meridian could better support those approaches. His questions revealed sophisticated knowledge of Japanese corporate hierarchy and the importance of allowing time for proper consultation among stakeholders. Takahashi's responses grew increasingly warm as he recognized that Tommy's curiosity was authentic rather than superficial. David contributed his academic expertise by discussing the theoretical frameworks that supported effective cross-cultural partnerships, explaining in Japanese how successful international relationships required ongoing commitment to cultural learning rather than one-time accommodations. His scholarly perspective provided intellectual depth to Tommy's intuitive diplomatic skills, creating a comprehensive approach to rebuilding trust that impressed Takahashi with its thoughtfulness and sincerity. The conversation shifted toward specific business terms as Takahashi began to express renewed interest in the partnership, but David and Tommy continued to prioritize cultural sensitivity over financial details. Tommy asked thoughtful questions about Japanese manufacturing standards and quality control processes, demonstrating respect for Takahashi's expertise while showing genuine desire to learn from his experience. The boys' natural diplomacy turned potentially difficult negotiations into collaborative problem-solving. Takahashi began sharing details about his company's manufacturing capabilities and technological innovations, his enthusiasm growing as he recognized that David and Tommy were genuinely interested in understanding Japanese approaches to business rather than simply imposing American methods. The conversation evolved from damage control into authentic relationship building as cultural barriers dissolved through mutual respect and understanding. David provided technical expertise about Meridian's requirements while Tommy served as cultural interpreter, ensuring that every exchange honored Japanese communication styles and business etiquette. Their partnership created a seamless blend of professional competence and cultural sensitivity that addressed all of Takahashi's previous concerns about working with American companies. The Japanese executives' initial skepticism transformed into genuine appreciation for their approach. As the call progressed, other Japanese executives who had remained silent during Morrison's previous disasters began participating actively in the discussion, their engagement reflecting growing confidence in Meridian's cultural transformation. Tommy responded to their contributions with appropriate respect and enthusiasm, demonstrating that his cultural understanding extended beyond simple language skills to encompass deeper appreciation for Japanese business values. Takahashi eventually asked David about his background and how he had developed such sophisticated understanding of Japanese culture, leading to a discussion of academic research and cultural exchange programs that further impressed the Japanese team with Meridian's intellectual depth. David's scholarly credentials provided additional credibility to their cultural approach while Tommy's natural charisma created emotional connection that transcended business considerations. The breakthrough moment came when Takahashi began discussing specific timeline and implementation details, indicating his renewed confidence in the partnership. Tommy's careful questions about quality standards and manufacturing processes demonstrated that Meridian's cultural sensitivity was matched by professional competence and attention to detail. The boys' combination of respect and intelligence clearly resonated with Takahashi's own values and business philosophy. By the end of the call, Takahashi had not only agreed to restore the original partnership terms but had proposed expanding their collaboration to include additional product lines and longer-term strategic planning. His final comments expressed genuine appreciation for meeting Americans who truly understood and respected Japanese business culture, indicating that the relationship had been transformed from a damaged negotiation into the foundation for extensive future cooperation. Rodriguez watched in amazement as David and Tommy accomplished in 90 minutes what Morrison had failed to achieve in 6 months of negotiations. Their authentic cultural approach had not only saved the $50 million deal but had created opportunities for even greater collaboration based on mutual respect and understanding. The call ended with Takahashi expressing personal gratitude for the opportunity to work with partners who demonstrated genuine appreciation for Japanese values and business practices. The immediate aftermath of the successful call was filled with a mixture of relief, amazement, and growing recognition of what had just been accomplished through authentic cross-cultural communication. Rodriguez found herself struggling to process the magnitude of the transformation that had occurred, from near disaster to expanded partnership, accomplished through the extraordinary abilities of a maintenance worker and his 80-year-old son. Takahashi's final comments during the call had included specific praise for Tommy's cultural sensitivity and David's scholarly approach to international relations, indicating that their success had created personal connections that would extend far beyond the immediate business relationship. The Japanese executive had expressed particular appreciation for meeting Americans who truly understood the importance of respect and patience in building lasting partnerships. The expanded partnership that emerged from the conversation included not only the original manufacturing agreement but also technology sharing arrangements and cultural exchange programs that would create ongoing opportunities for collaboration between the two companies. Takahashi had proposed regular visits and joint training programs that would deepen the relationship while providing learning opportunities for both organizations. Rodriguez immediately began documenting the cultural protocols and communication strategies that David and Tommy had employed, recognizing that their approach represented a replicable methodology that could be applied to other international partnerships. The success had provided a template for authentic cross-cultural business development that could transform Meridian's competitive position in global markets. The ripple effects of their success began almost immediately as news of the restored partnership spread through the building, creating an atmosphere of celebration and renewed confidence among employees who had been worried about their futures just hours earlier. The dramatic reversal demonstrated the power of genuine expertise and cultural sensitivity to create value that conventional business approaches could never achieve. David found himself processing the emotional impact of using his academic knowledge in a real-world crisis situation for the first time since leaving Columbia University, recognizing that the intellectual satisfaction of solving complex problems through scholarly expertise had been one of the things he had missed most during his years of enforced invisibility. The success had validated his decision to reveal his background despite the personal risks involved. Tommy's performance during the call had exceeded everyone's expectations, demonstrating diplomatic skills and cultural understanding that seemed to transcend his chronological age while maintaining the authentic warmth and curiosity that made him so effective in cross-cultural communication. His natural abilities had been perfectly suited to the delicate work of rebuilding damaged relationships through genuine respect and understanding. The success had also created opportunities for both David and Tommy to use their combined expertise in ways that could benefit not just Meridian International but the broader business community that struggled with cross-cultural challenges. Rodriguez was already envisioning consulting opportunities and speaking engagements that would allow them to share their insights with other organizations facing similar difficulties. As the celebration continued and the implications of their success became clearer, David realized that this moment marked the beginning of a completely new chapter in their lives, one where their extraordinary abilities would finally be recognized and valued rather than hidden out of necessity and fear. The silence that followed the end of the Takahashi call was profound and electric, filled with the weight of transformation that occurs when impossible situations suddenly resolve into perfect solutions. Rodriguez stared at David and Tommy with an expression that combined amazement, gratitude, and the dawning realization that she had just witnessed something extraordinary. The $50 million partnership that had seemed irretrievably lost 90 minutes earlier was not only restored but expanded beyond their original projections, and the credit belonged entirely to a maintenance worker and his 80-year-old son. Rodriguez's first words were spoken in a voice thick with emotion as she thanked David and Tommy for saving not just a business deal but potentially the entire future of Meridian International's expansion into Asian markets. She explained that Takahashi's endorsement would open doors throughout the region, that other companies would view their partnership as validation of Meridian's cultural competence and reliability. The ripple effects of their success would extend far beyond the immediate financial impact. David felt a mixture of relief and disorientation as he processed the magnitude of what had just occurred, recognizing that this moment marked the end of his years in hiding and the beginning of a completely different life. Tommy reached over and took his father's hand, his young face glowing with pride and satisfaction at having helped solve such an important problem. The boy's natural empathy allowed him to understand that this success meant more than just business achievement. It represented the restoration of his father's professional identity and the validation of gifts that had been hidden for too long. Rodriguez immediately began discussing the practical implications of their success, explaining that David's expertise would be essential for managing the expanded relationship with Takahashi Group and developing similar partnerships throughout Asia. She offered him the position of Director of International Relations, with a salary that reflected his qualifications and the value he had just demonstrated to the company. The irony of being promoted from maintenance worker to executive in a single afternoon was not lost on any of them. The news of their success spread rapidly throughout the building as Rodriguez called emergency meetings to announce the restored partnership and introduce David in his new role. Employees who had known him only as the quiet maintenance worker struggled to reconcile his humble previous position with his obvious expertise and sophistication. Tommy became an instant celebrity among the staff, with everyone marveling at his linguistic abilities and diplomatic skills. Mrs. Rodriguez from Human Resources apologized profusely for not recognizing David's qualifications earlier, but he graciously explained that his circumstances had required discretion and that he harbored no resentment about his previous treatment. Tommy helped ease the awkwardness by charming everyone with his enthusiasm about his father's new position and his own excitement about continuing to help with international communications when appropriate. Rodriguez arranged for David to have Morrison's former office, a spacious suite with windows overlooking the city and all the technological resources necessary for managing complex international relationships. Tommy explored the new space with obvious delight, examining the conference table where important decisions would be made and testing the video equipment that would connect them with partners around the world. The boy's natural curiosity about different cultures made him the perfect assistant for his father's new responsibilities. The afternoon brought a steady stream of congratulatory calls from board members and investors who had heard about the miraculous recovery of the Takahashi partnership. Rodriguez took particular satisfaction in explaining how the solution had come from talent that was already within the company, hidden beneath assumptions about job titles and social status. The story of David and Tommy's intervention became an instant legend within Meridian's corporate culture. David spent his first hours as Director of International Relations reviewing the files that Morrison had left behind, quickly identifying multiple other relationships that were suffering from cultural insensitivity and poor communication. His academic expertise allowed him to diagnose problems that had been developing for months, and he began developing strategies for addressing each situation with the cultural sensitivity that had been missing from Morrison's approach. Tommy established himself at a small desk in his father's office, working on homework while occasionally offering insights about cultural practices he had learned from the diverse community around their apartment building. His natural curiosity about different languages and customs made him an invaluable resource for understanding the subtle communication patterns that could make or break international partnerships. The transformation in their circumstances felt almost surreal as David tried to process the day's events. That morning he had been emptying wastebaskets and restocking supplies, invisible to the corporate world around him. By afternoon he was fielding calls from international partners and planning strategies for expanding Meridian's global presence. The speed of the change was dizzying, but the work itself felt like returning home after a long exile. Rodriguez called a company-wide meeting to formally announce David's appointment and celebrate the restored Takahashi partnership. She used the occasion to emphasize that talent could be found anywhere within an organization, and that assumptions about people based on their current positions could blind companies to extraordinary capabilities. The story of David and Tommy's intervention became a powerful lesson about looking beyond surface appearances to recognize true value. As the day drew to a close, David found himself sitting in his new office looking out at the city skyline, reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him from academic obscurity through years of invisible labor to this moment of professional restoration. Tommy worked quietly nearby, occasionally asking questions about their new responsibilities and expressing excitement about the international relationships they would help build together. The phone rang with another congratulatory call, this time from a reporter who had heard about the unusual circumstances surrounding the Takahashi deal and wanted to write a human interest story about hidden talent in unexpected places. David politely declined the interview, preferring to focus on the work rather than publicity, but the call reminded him that their story had implications beyond Meridian International. If this story has touched your heart and shown you something beautiful about human potential and hidden gifts, let us know where you're listening from tonight. Perhaps you've witnessed your own moments when people surprised you with capabilities you never expected, or maybe you understand what it means to have talents that the world hasn't yet recognized. Rodriguez stopped by David's office as the building grew quiet, thanking him again for saving the company and expressing her excitement about the future they would build together. She apologized for the years he had spent in positions that failed to utilize his abilities, but David assured her that those experiences had given him perspective and appreciation that would inform his approach to international relations. Every job had taught him something valuable about human dignity and the importance of treating all people with respect. Tommy packed his homework into his backpack with the satisfied expression of someone who had accomplished something important, asking his father if they could celebrate their new beginning with dinner at Mr. Tanaka's Japanese restaurant. David agreed enthusiastically, thinking it would be fitting to honor the man who had helped Tommy develop the language skills that had saved the day. As they prepared to leave their new office, both father and son understood that their lives had been transformed in ways that would create possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine. 3 weeks after the miraculous Takahashi intervention, David Chen's transformation from invisible maintenance worker to celebrated international relations director had created ripples throughout the corporate world that extended far beyond Meridian International's offices. The story of hidden talent discovered in unexpected places had captured the imagination of business leaders and media outlets, turning David and Tommy into symbols of untapped potential that existed within every organization. Their success had prompted companies across the country to reconsider how they identified and utilized the capabilities of their employees. The Takahashi partnership had exceeded everyone's expectations, with Kenji Takahashi personally recommending Meridian to other Japanese companies as an example of an American corporation that truly understood and respected Asian business culture. David found himself managing not just the original $50 million contract but 3 additional partnerships worth a combined total of over $200 million. Tommy had become an unofficial cultural ambassador, helping to facilitate communications and build relationships with international partners who were charmed by his linguistic abilities and diplomatic wisdom. Rodriguez had restructured Meridian's entire international division around David's expertise, creating a new model for cross-cultural business development that prioritized genuine understanding over aggressive sales tactics. David's academic background allowed him to design training programs that taught employees how to recognize and respect cultural differences, transforming Meridian's reputation from culturally insensitive to genuinely inclusive. The company's stock price had risen 30% since the Takahashi announcement, reflecting investor confidence in their new approach to global expansion. Tommy's role had evolved beyond simple translation assistance to become a genuine contributor to international relationship building, with several Asian partners specifically requesting his participation in video conferences and cultural exchange discussions. His natural empathy and linguistic gifts had proven invaluable for understanding subtle communication patterns and identifying potential misunderstandings before they could damage business relationships. The boys' presence in meetings had become a competitive advantage for Meridian, demonstrating their commitment to authentic cultural engagement. David's new position had brought financial stability that allowed them to move from their small apartment to a comfortable house in a neighborhood with excellent schools and a diverse international community. Tommy's linguistic abilities had flourished in this environment, where he could practice multiple languages with neighbors from around the world. The boy had also been enrolled in a gifted education program that challenged his intellectual capabilities while nurturing his natural curiosity about different cultures. The academic world had taken notice of David's return to prominence, with Columbia University offering him an adjunct teaching position that would allow him to share his practical experience with the next generation of international relations specialists. David had accepted the offer enthusiastically, recognizing the opportunity to bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and real-world application. Tommy often accompanied his father to the university, charming graduate students with his insights about cross-cultural communication. Rodriguez had nominated David for several industry awards recognizing innovation in international business development, and his success had attracted attention from consulting firms and think tanks interested in his unique perspective on cultural sensitivity in corporate environments. David had begun writing articles about the hidden costs of cultural insensitivity and the competitive advantages that came from genuine cross-cultural understanding, contributing to academic and business publications that reached decision-makers throughout the global economy. Tommy's story had inspired educational initiatives designed to identify and nurture linguistic talents in young people, with several school districts implementing programs that celebrated multilingual abilities rather than treating them as curiosities. The boy had become a spokesperson for cultural diversity, speaking at conferences and educational events about the importance of understanding different perspectives and treating all people with respect regardless of their backgrounds. The transformation in their daily routine reflected the magnitude of their changed circumstances, with David now spending his days in high-level strategic meetings and international conference calls while Tommy attended advanced classes that challenged his exceptional abilities. Their evenings were filled with preparation for the next day's cultural exchanges and discussions about the fascinating people they had met from countries around the world. The work that had once been David's hidden passion had become their shared adventure. Rodriguez had established a talent identification program based on the lesson learned from David's experience, requiring managers to look beyond job titles and surface appearances to recognize the full range of capabilities possessed by their employees. The program had already identified several other individuals whose talents had been overlooked, leading to promotions and reassignments that better utilized their skills. David served as a mentor for these newly recognized employees, helping them navigate the transition from invisible to valued. The international community had embraced David and Tommy as examples of what was possible when cultural barriers were approached with genuine respect and understanding. Invitations arrived regularly for speaking engagements and cultural exchange programs, with organizations around the world eager to learn from their success in building authentic cross-cultural partnerships. Their story had become a case study in business schools and international relations programs. Tommy's teachers marveled at his ability to help classmates from different cultural backgrounds feel welcomed and understood, using his linguistic skills to facilitate friendships and resolve misunderstandings. The boy's natural diplomacy had made him a leader among his peers, demonstrating that empathy and cultural sensitivity were valuable skills that could benefit everyone. His success had inspired other students to take interest in learning about different cultures and languages. David's relationship with his former maintenance colleagues had evolved into mutual respect and friendship, with several of them seeking his advice about career development and continuing education. He had learned that many of his former co-workers possessed hidden talents and unrealized ambitions, leading him to advocate for expanded training and development programs that would help all employees reach their full potential. The experience had reinforced his belief that human dignity and worth existed regardless of job titles or social status. The ripple effects of their transformation continued to spread through unexpected channels, with other companies implementing cultural sensitivity training and talent identification programs inspired by Meridian's success. David had been invited to consult with government agencies about improving international diplomatic relationships, bringing his academic expertise and practical experience to bear on complex global challenges. Tommy's presence at these meetings had become a powerful symbol of the next generation's potential to bridge cultural divides. As their first month in their new roles drew to a close, David reflected on the journey that had brought them from invisible survival to celebrated success, recognizing that their story represented more than personal achievement. They had become living proof that extraordinary talent could be found in the most unexpected places, and that genuine respect for human dignity could create opportunities that benefited everyone involved. Their transformation had begun with a simple desire to help others communicate better, but it had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful than either of them had ever imagined possible. 6 months after Tommy's extraordinary intervention had saved the Takahashi partnership, David Chen stood before a packed auditorium at Columbia University delivering the keynote address for the International Relations Department's annual conference. The same lecture hall where he had once taught graduate courses now hosted him as a celebrated practitioner whose real-world success had validated years of academic theory. Tommy sat in the front row, his presence serving as a living reminder that the most profound insights about human communication often came from the most unexpected sources. David's speech focused on the hidden costs of cultural assumptions and the transformative power of genuine respect in international relationships, drawing from his unique experience of observing corporate failures from positions of invisibility before being called upon to solve them. The audience of academics, diplomats, and business leaders listened intently as he described how authentic cultural sensitivity could create competitive advantages that exceeded any technological innovation or financial strategy. The presentation concluded with Tommy joining his father on stage to demonstrate their collaborative approach to cross-cultural communication, speaking in multiple languages while David provided academic context for their methods. The young boy's natural charisma and sophisticated understanding of diplomatic protocols impressed the distinguished audience, many of whom had never witnessed such advanced linguistic and cultural skills in someone so young. Their partnership represented a new model for international relations that combined scholarly expertise with intuitive emotional intelligence. Following the conference, David and Tommy returned to Meridian International, where their influence had fundamentally transformed the company's approach to global business development. The international division that David now led had become the most profitable segment of the corporation, with partnerships spanning 6 continents and cultural relationships that competitors struggled to replicate. Tommy's role had evolved into that of cultural consultant, helping to design programs that celebrated diversity while building authentic understanding between different communities. Rodriguez had implemented company-wide policies based on the lessons learned from David's experience, creating advancement opportunities for employees regardless of their current positions and establishing mentorship programs that identified hidden talents throughout the organization. The success of these initiatives had attracted attention from business schools and consulting firms, with Meridian's human resources practices becoming a model for companies seeking to maximize their intellectual capital. The Chen family's new home had become an informal embassy for the international community, with business partners and cultural attaches regularly visiting for dinners that combined professional networking with genuine friendship. Tommy delighted in these gatherings, practicing his language skills with native speakers while learning about customs and traditions from around the world. The boy's natural curiosity and respectful approach to different cultures had made him a favorite among visitors who appreciated his sincere interest in their backgrounds. David's academic writing had resumed with articles and papers that bridged the gap between theoretical frameworks and practical applications in international business development. His unique perspective as someone who had observed corporate failures from positions of invisibility before implementing successful solutions had provided insights that purely academic or business-focused researchers could not match. Universities around the country had begun incorporating his case studies into their curricula. Tommy's linguistic abilities had continued to develop at an extraordinary pace, with his current count of fluent languages reaching 12 and his conversational skills extending to 8 additional tongues. More importantly, his understanding of cultural nuances and diplomatic communication had matured beyond his years, making him an invaluable asset in situations requiring delicate cross-cultural navigation. Several international organizations had expressed interest in sponsoring his continued education and cultural development. The ripple effects of their transformation had extended throughout the business community, with other companies implementing talent identification programs designed to recognize capabilities that might be hidden beneath surface appearances. David had been invited to consult with Fortune 500 companies about developing inclusive practices that maximized human potential regardless of employees' current positions or backgrounds. His success had become proof that authentic diversity initiatives could generate substantial financial returns. Rodriguez had promoted David to Senior Vice President of Global Relations, a position that gave him authority over all international partnerships and cultural development programs. Tommy had been granted special status as Cultural Ambassador, a role that allowed him to participate in appropriate business functions while maintaining his focus on education and personal development. Their partnership had become legendary within Meridian's corporate culture and beyond. The academic world had embraced David's return with offers for permanent faculty positions and research opportunities that would allow him to study cross-cultural communication from both theoretical and practical perspectives. He had accepted a part-time professorship that enabled him to teach graduate courses while maintaining his corporate responsibilities, creating a unique career path that combined scholarly inquiry with real-world application. Tommy's influence on his classmates and teachers had been profound, with his school implementing programs that celebrated multilingual abilities and encouraged students to learn about different cultures. The boy's natural empathy and diplomatic skills had made him a leader among his peers, demonstrating that cultural sensitivity and emotional intelligence were valuable capabilities that could benefit everyone in increasingly diverse communities. The media attention surrounding their story had generated opportunities for David to speak at conferences and forums around the world, sharing insights about hidden talent and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize human potential. Tommy often accompanied him to these events, charming audiences with his linguistic demonstrations while reinforcing the message that extraordinary abilities could be found in the most unexpected places. As their first year in their transformed circumstances drew to a close, David reflected on the journey that had taken them from invisible survival to celebrated success, recognizing that their story represented something larger than personal achievement. They had become symbols of the untapped potential that existed within every community and organization, proof that genuine respect for human dignity could create opportunities that benefited everyone involved. If this story of hidden talents discovered and dreams fulfilled has inspired you tonight, we would love to hear from our global community of listeners. Where in the world are you joining us from, and what time is it as you listen to this tale of transformation and hope? Your engagement means everything to us, and knowing that these stories reach hearts and minds across continents reminds us why we continue sharing these powerful narratives. Tommy continued to amaze everyone who met him with his combination of linguistic brilliance and genuine humility, using his extraordinary gifts to help others feel understood and valued. His presence in David's professional life had become more than just assistance, it represented the next generation's potential to bridge cultural divides and create a more connected world. Their partnership demonstrated that the most powerful solutions often emerged from the combination of experience and innocence, wisdom and wonder. The future stretched before them filled with possibilities neither had dared to imagine during their years of hidden struggle, but both understood that their greatest achievement was not the recognition or financial success they had gained. Their true victory lay in the proof that every person possessed inherent worth and potential, and that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts were waiting to be discovered in the most ordinary places. Subscribe to join our community of dreamers and believers who understand that remarkable stories of human triumph happen every day, often in the most unexpected circumstances, reminding us all that everyone has something extraordinary to offer the world.